Well, welcome. It is Saturday now, and we are going to think briefly about Saturday then, a quiet day. There's not a great deal to talk about, that is, as far as the narrative itself, but I want to spend some time with some background issues. So once again, forgive the slight tardiness. Again, I had a little trouble going to Facebook Live, but took the counsel of some friends from earlier struggles and cleared the cache, and didn't know what that meant before, but it did work. So here we are, and it is Saturday, and as I say, it's a day which gets little ink in the biblical record, but it's worth thinking about. But again, there are just a couple of issues, and I'm actually going to be brief this morning and try and make up a little bit for yesterday's marathon, perhaps. But there are basically, as we've set out to trace day by day the events of the Passion Week, as so carefully and perfectly, that is inerrantly recorded in the four Gospels. But again, I've made this point again and again that it's so important for us to, let's say it this way, that these biblical stories in all of their parts, including, of course, the story before us, the story of Jesus' life and ministry as recorded in the gospel, and then the Passion Week, to which a disproportionate amount of space is given, and so on. But all of this is real history, and history that can withstand whatever level of scrutiny, of careful historical scrutiny, we bring to it. And I think it's important to do that, to treat it and defend these stories, treat these stories and defend these stories as real history. And that means that there must be coherence. It must be real world. It must be liable to examination with regard to all the various elements of real history, people and time and interrelationship and its relationship, that is, between people and then with other broader history and so on. So I lose my way entirely, forgive me. My point is that what we've tried to do, at least in part, throughout this study, is, number one, to protect the integrity of the record. That is, to acknowledge that it is God's word, that the words are true, and so the record is true in all of its parts. And where there are elements that seem to be incongruous or incoherent, incongruous in the sense they just don't make sense, incoherent in the sense that they don't fit together, and so on. So the point is, I've spent too much time. In the interest of protecting the integrity of the record and then fleshing out the narrative, I want to go to just two background issues today that will seem, well, they're a little bit, I wouldn't say technical, but they're just that. They're background issues. And I trust that they'll be helpful to you. But first of all, I want to talk about the year in which Jesus died. And what year did Jesus die? And that's going to take me to another subject, which has to do with the man Pilate once again. But with regard to the year of the crucifixion, now this can get very, very technical and complicated, and there are all sorts of arguments and counter arguments and cross-current issues and so on. But I think we can reduce it to this, that basically the parameters are these, that we know that Pilate was the prefect in Judea, Samaria, when Jesus died. We know that from the scriptures. Tacitus remembers this, the first century Roman historian. Philo remembers it, and so on, that it has Jesus being crucified when Pilate was the prefect. Now, let me stop on that real quickly and say this, that Pilate's being a prefect, that is, the fact that the Bible calls, I'm going to start over, my mind's a little spacey. It's kind of interesting that early Roman historians assign a title to Pilate different than what the Bible and Luke specifically assigns. And very early Roman historians refer to Pilate as a procurator. And it's a different term, and it's a different, really, concept than the Bible's term, which is governor or prefect. And it's just kind of in terms of the integrity of the biblical record. Let me just say this. It just occurred to me, forgive me, but for years, one of the arguments against the historicity of the New Testament narrative, and specifically of Luke, was that Luke calls him a prefect, and yet very early Roman historians, that's important, call him a procurator. And so the argument was that evidently Luke, number one, he was writing late, and number two, he was not all that good a historian because he got confused about the proper title. But then in Caesarea Maritima, that marvelous city that Herod the Great built on the Mediterranean, archaeologists dug out of actually the theater, just a slab of rock that was being used as a step in the theater. But when they examined it, they realized that it had an inscription on it. And it was an inscription made by Pilate, evidently in dedication of some monument or structure. But at any rate, it's called the Pilate inscription, and it's in the museum in Israel, and it is there's a replica of it there at Caesarea Maritima. You always stop and see that. But the interesting thing is that explicitly on that inscription, the title assigned to Pilate is exactly the same as Latin versus Greek, but it's the same title that Luke uses. And it really is marvelous, and we find this again and again, a vindication of the precise historical accuracy of Luke. And what's curious about that is it's now been determined that an emperor, and I think it was Claudius, I'm quite sure, but at any rate, an emperor in the 40s changed the nomenclature. And so those who might have been called a prefect before were now called a procurator. And in point of fact, the very early Roman historians, think about this, they get it wrong. Those early historians call Pilate a procurator because by that time that was the appropriate title. But they were the ones who were the careless historians. They called him a procurator. He never was. He was a prefect. On the other hand, Luke gets it right, which means, think about this, that Luke must have been an eyewitness, because we know that he must have been writing very early, because we know very well that that little tidbit of information had been lost by those early Roman historians. So I hope that makes some sense. I just got to thinking about it with regard to Pilate and this whole business of the integrity of the scriptural record. And again, archaeology has played that role. They have vindicated the historicity of the scripture, in spite of the fact, which you hear all the time, that archaeology is primarily an enemy of the scriptures, in the sense that they disprove. It's not so. There's never been a hard archaeological fact which disproves or discredits the historical integrity of the scriptural record. Now, having got off on that rabbit trail, let me just say this. We don't believe the Bible because archaeology proves it. We don't suspend belief until archaeology proves it. As a matter of fact, I will reject any truth claim of archaeology which clearly contradicts the scripture. I have bottomlessly, infinitely more confidence in the historical veracity and dependability of the scripture than I do in the dependability of archaeology. Don't get me started there. But archaeology is so subjective, and everybody will acknowledge that. But this is just one point. So I'm saying we were confident in Luke's record before archaeology confirmed it, but in point of fact, it has been confirmed. And even the existence of the man Pilate, though there was very little doubt about that. But I'm going to come back to it. I want to talk about the year of crucifixion. And what we know for sure is that Pilate was the prefect. He was the governor who oversaw the trial and ultimate execution of Jesus. Well, Pilate ruled from 26 to 36. So those are our parameters. I finally get to it. So we know that Jesus, the events that we're talking about occurred somewhere between 26 and 36 AD, the year of our Lord. Common era, if you don't mind. But if you prefer, I should say. Now, all we're going to do, honestly, is take the perpetual calendars, that is, extrapolate the calendar back into history. And there are some questions about this. It's not a simple one-for-one effort, but it can be done, and with some confidence. And we're going to look for years in which Nisan 14 fell on a Thursday night, Friday. In other words, beginning at sundown. So remember that the Passover has to happen on a specific day of the month, the 14th of the Hebrew spring month Nisan. And so we're going to ask ourselves, in how many years did the 14th of Nisan, between 26 and 36, and how many years? And did Nisan 14 fall on a Thursday, Friday? And really, when you do all the work and the dust settles, there are two. And those are 30 and 33. And to be honest with you, there are many, many good men, smarter than myself by a long shot, who embrace 30 AD. And I understand that, and I understand the arguments and so on. I think 33 is much to be preferred. Now, this has to do, and this is I'm going to go to one more step of complexity, and I'm not going to spend any time with this, but this relates very much to the year in which Herod, or let's say it this way, the year in which Jesus was born. And that is in large part a function of the year in which Herod died, because we know that Herod was alive when Jesus was born. He tried to kill him. And Josephus has some really tantalizing information about the death of Herod the Great, we're talking. And for one thing, he says that Herod died shortly after an eclipse of the moon. So now we get into the whole question of the year in which Herod died. And this becomes important simply because we know that Jesus was born before Herod died. And we're told that Jesus was about 30 years of age when he went to be baptized. And then you have about 3.5 years to get to the year of his crucifixion. All right, now this is not making any sense to anybody out there. So let me just cut to the quick here. All of this is live and a little bit ad hoc this morning, to be honest with you. But I'll simplify it to this, that there are a number of interrelated chronological issues. One of the big ones is the year in which Herod died. Historically, I say historically, for the last 50 years or so, the prevailing notion is that Herod died in 4 BC because there was an eclipse in March of 4 BC that was identified as the eclipse to which Josephus had reference. And so now, if he's born in 4 BC and Jesus dies at around the age of 30 or 33, I'm sorry, around the age of 33 or 34, then it makes more sense to have him dying in 30 AD. You can do the arithmetic. So again, I told myself to leave this alone, but 30 AD is when Jesus went to be, 30 years of age is when Jesus went to be baptized. And it was about 3.5 years later that he died. And consequently, if he was born somewhere before 4 BC, 30 AD is a more reasonable idea for his death. Now, it's not again a one-for-one. On the other hand, of late, and I'm talking about in my experience the last 10 or 12, 15 years, there's been a lot of reconsideration of that date of Herod's death. And I think it's fair to say that widely prevailing understanding today, although you'll not see this in many books, it'll be 4 BC is the death of Herod and so on, and therefore Jesus was born sometime before that. But I think but clearly the prevailing opinion today is that Herod died in 1 BC. And that's a function of the fact that there was also an eclipse of the moon in January of 1 BC. And whereas there are other time considerations that are very, very difficult with the 4 BC, but they work really well with the 1 BC. And the 1 BC eclipse of the moon was late at night, so it was very visible. The 4 BC was just as the moon was rising, and so it was hard to see. And it was total, whereas the other one was partial. The 4 BC was partial, and it was much more visible in the area of Israel, which is interesting because Josephus makes it a marker, kind of a chronological reminder and marker for the death of Herod. Now, again, I got back into it, and I know I'm losing you, but suffice it to say that if you, in fact, Herod died in 1 BC, and Jesus was born shortly before that, then it calculates very, very easily to a 33 BC AD. A 33 AD. If I were taping this, I would just start over, but I'm not. So if I haven't lost you entirely, I'll summarize it this way, that we know that Pilate was ruling. That's between 26 and 36. If we just look for a year in which Nisan 14 fell on the appropriate day, you come down to 30 and 33. 30 is very viable, but it becomes shakier if you believe, as I do, that Herod died in 1 BC. And now it's almost certain that Jesus' public ministry, his baptism, let's say it that way, he would have gone to be baptized when he was about 30, so that's somewhere around 29 AD, and so Jesus dies in 33. Now there's something else, and I'm going to, everybody kind of take a collective breath and say, okay, clear your head. And let me go to something that is, I think, a little bit more meaningful, but it relates to this. One of the arguments that I would appeal to in defense of the 33 AD is that let me back up. The man Pilate was quite clearly sponsored by a very important man back in Rome named Sejanus. That is, it was Sejanus who was a friend of Pilate and who had acted as his advocate or patron and who had gotten him the assignment there in Judea, Samaria. So Sejanus was his, as I say, sort of his sponsor. This was very, very important in Roman culture. You had to have somebody advocate before the government. And now Sejanus was the captain of the Praetorian Guard for Tiberius the censor, the Caesar. Remember, when Jesus is born, Augustus is the Caesar. But Augustus dies, Octavian, the first Roman Caesar. But he dies in 13, I believe it's 13, might be 14. But at any rate, he is succeeded by, he passes the empire to his adopted son, Tiberius. And Tiberius, by the time we get to the ministry of Jesus, Sejanus is the captain of his Praetorian Guard. Now, the Praetorian Guard was that crack militia that was assigned personally to the Caesar, and they were cared for carefully. They were deeply trusted. Listen, let me just tell you something. A little bit of background. Every Roman emperor had his greatest fear was the army. There were very powerful generals. They were spread around the world. And normally, if there was a real revolt against the Roman emperor, it came from some quarter in the army. And so he would have troops that were especially close to him that he treated very well. It was a very, very elitist position to be part of that Praetorian Guard. And then the person who watched over that Praetorian Guard was the captain of the guard. And it was the most trusted position. That is the most, he had access to the emperor had to trust him and so on. Well, at any rate, Sejanus was the captain of the Praetorian Guard under Tiberius. And Sejanus had been very, very pivotal in assigning, in Pilate's becoming the prefect there in Judea, Samaria. So what's that got to do with anything? Sejanus, actually, it's a fascinating story. In October of 31, remember now, I believe Jesus is going to die on April 3rd, 33 AD. That is, he's going to die, and the date I would assign to it is April 3rd, 33. Well, in late 31, Sejanus, who was about to be made co-emperor with Tiberius, And when we think of the emperor, we think of just absolute, that's power, authority, nobody questions. That's not really true. The Senate made the man the emperor, the principal leader, the first among equals, and they assigned him a number of prerogatives. Now, those prerogatives functionally gave him virtually absolute authority, because one of the most important of those prerogatives was universal veto. And no matter what the Senate did, he could veto it. But at any rate, there was a list of prerogatives which belonged to the emperor. And as I say, they made him the functional, ultimate authority. But Sejanus had already been assigned most of that list, and he was thinking that he was going to be given that he was going to become kind of co-emperor. They were also going to give him those prerogatives, and he was invited to the Senate, and it was his birthday. And when he got there, expecting that sort of promotion, if you don't mind, when he got there, he was it was revealed that his plot against Tiberius had been discovered. Now, by this time, Tiberius was a lecherous madman who was living on an island, Capri, and was giving himself to every sort of wickedness. And he really had more or less turned the governance of the empire over to Sejanus day by day. But Sejanus had a plot to put Tiberius to death, and he was discovered in that plot. And he was taken out to a certain rock in the river Tiber and dashed to death, and his body thrown in the river. And that's how the standard Roman execution for seditionists, in this case, for rebels against the Caesar. But the point is, Sejanus was Pilate's sponsor. And it's really curious. There was a bit of a purge, and all of those who were loyal to Sejanus throughout the empire were also executed. It was a gruesome season. And there is a bit of a historical, it really is a bit of a mystery as to how Pilate survived that. Now, I think there are a lot of possible answers, but the fact is that this explains my next question. This relates to my next question. So I'm just going to say, just to sum it up, I think it's best to understand on several counts that Jesus died in 33 AD. There are some chronological issues, and they're worth studying and so on. Obviously, that's the crux of the issue. But on the other hand, there is this issue of Sejanus, and that really plays in. But to get to that, I've got to talk about something else, which is really more important, and that is the perceived disparity between the historical record of Pilate and the biblical record of Pilate. Now, if I haven't already lost you, I probably did just then, but I'm begging you, stay with me and see if I can make this make sense to you. The fact is that the extra biblical record of the man Pilate really makes him a brutal thug. And yet in the Gospels, Pilate is quite quiescent, quite acquiescent is a better word. He's not just quiet, but he's willing to bend to the demands of the Jews. And the Jews do finally, the Jewish leadership, now I'm going to be careful, we've talked about this before, but the Jewish leadership does in fact finally, in spite of the fact that Pilate was, by Peter's testimony, so determined to let Jesus go, he finally caves in to the demand of the Jews. And this seems entirely, it seems a bit, maybe not entirely, but it seems a bit contradictory to the extra biblical record of Pilate. Now, I want to talk about the issue at stake, and then I want to quickly talk about a heresy that arises out of this that needs to be settled. But I'm really trying to emphasize the coherency of the entire record. So let me just say, first of all, that yes, there is a seeming disparity between the record of Pilate in the Gospels, where he is moldable and bendable by the Jewish leadership, and in the two primary extra-biblical Roman sources that seem to make him much more of a brutal thug who is entirely insensitive to the Jewish people and the Jewish leadership. So here you have this brutal extra biblical thug, and then you have this somewhat acquiescent, approachable, bendable, biblical Pilate. How are you going to reconcile the two? Quickly. The two historians who thus represent Pilate are Josephus and Philo. Philo earlier, Josephus later. Now, this gets quite, there's a lot to this, and I'm not going to take you through it other than to say this, that they both tell a couple of stories. Both Philo, who is a Jewish philosopher, but he's very Romanized, and he's an advocate, actually. He is an advocate arguing before the Roman Senate on behalf of Herod Agrippa I. Josephus, of course, we could get deeply lost in Josephus, but Josephus, I need to tell you this. All right, let me sort it out. Both Philo and Josephus tell a couple of stories about Pilate. And one of them has to do with the fact that when he came to the city as the new prefect, he brought some standards which had, and the stories are confused, and even Josephus tells it twice and their details are confused. But evidently there was something on those standards. The Roman soldiers always, each battalion had a standard, and that standard was precious to it. And there was something on that standard. Whether it was the picture of the emperor, just the name of the emperor, again, the records are disparate, that was offensive to the Jews, and the Jews approached Pilate, and Pilate refused and threatened to punish them for it. They had come down to Caesarea Maritima, and finally Pilate appealed to Tiberius, and Tiberius said, "No, take the standards down." That's the story. So Pilate was insensitive to the religious sensibilities of the Jewish people, and Tiberius had to force his hand. The other story is that there was a massive, remarkably engineered aqueduct system that watered the city of Jerusalem from Bethlehem and even south of that. They had built an aqueduct that came about 5 miles, and it was drawing from springs and a man-made lake, actually, that they had crafted to bring the water into Jerusalem. Well, that aqueduct had to be improved and enlarged, and Pilate set out to do that. These are the stories. And in order to finance it, he went to the Jewish leadership and demanded that they give him some of the money out of the treasury. And so they robbed the Korban, the treasury, in order to build this aqueduct. Now, in both cases, both Philo and Josephus tell those stories, and they represent Pilate as just being very much a thug and just demanding it and insensitive to the Jewish people. Well, in point of fact, both of those Roman historians, Philo and Josephus, have an axe to grind. And Philo is, I said I was going to be brief, look at the time. All right. Philo is an advocate for Herod Agrippa. And Herod Agrippa wants to be king over all of Israel, and he's all of the Jewish people, and he's going to actually be made that. But in order to make the case that even though there are Roman officers in place in that part of the world, that there should be an overall king, because that'll keep the Jewish people happier and more quiet. And so it's very much in Philo's interest to paint those various Roman officers, including the prefect Pilate, in as negative a light as possible. And he does. He really, really beats up on Pilate unreasonably by any standard. And some Roman historians, some very good secular Roman historians, use the phrase character assassination, that what Philo is doing is character assassination, and the same thing can be said of Pilate. Now, Pilate's concern is a little different. Josephus's concern is a little different. Josephus has been he's been made part very much of Roman culture. He was very much a Jew. He was part of the rebellion in AD 70. He surrendered. He was brought to Rome. He undertook the effort to write the history of the Jews in order to in the history of the rebellion in 70 AD, 66 to 70, and Josephus set out to write. That's called the Wars of the Jews, a very, very important late first century document, but not Bible by any means, but remarkably good history for the day. But the point to be made is that Josephus very much has an agenda, and that is he wants to restore the reputation of the Jewish people, because you've had this rebellion and it was ugly and it went on forever and ever, and so he wants to blame the rebellion on somebody other than the Jews, or he wants to make a case for the Jewish rebellion, and so he paints as black a picture as he possibly can of Pilate. So what Josephus is doing is saying, all right, they did rebel, and it was ugly rebellion, but you can't blame them because, man, the prefect was so gruesome and brutal. Now, again, it's been characterized as character assassination by disinterested, that is, they're not trying to protect the scriptures at all. All right, now let me back up. So I'm just saying that there is the persuasion that there is irreconcilable disparity between the picture of Pilate in the scriptures and the historical record of Pilate in extra-biblical writings. That's the disparity I'm dealing with. And I'm saying that, number one, the disparity is overblown entirely, because the only really two Roman historical sources are clearly writing with an agenda. And I think they deliberately cast Pilate in a much more negative light than he deserves to have been cast. Now, let me stop and say this as well, folks. And this is a comment which would, well, this is a thought, I should say, that would not be allowed in the secular world. But for my money, if you've got extra biblical sources, historical, and you've got the Gospels are the more reliable source by my lights, because they're breathed out by God. But even if you leave that alone, the biblical records are, number one, you have 4 of them, all telling the same thing. Number 2, they're written very, very early, and they purport to be and are ultimately eyewitness accounts, where neither Philo nor Josephus was an eyewitness account. So just at the level of historiography, which are the most dependable, the Bible, no, it's never allowed that. The Bible in all of its parts, Old and New Testament, is always treated in the secular world as if it is intrinsically suspect. So it's a lousy history, so you don't believe it. As a matter of fact, the Bible is treated with greater disregard and contempt than any other historical record. And I think there's a spiritual reason for that. But the point is that you do have this perceived disparity. I think the disparity is much overblown, but let me take you back to Seditionist, because let's just rehearse. If in fact Seditionist was Pilate's sponsor, and if in fact it was in about October of 31 that Seditionist had been executed for sedition, and if Pilate, he survived whatever purge came of that, but nonetheless, he was on thin ice, or to say it this way, he no longer had a sponsor back there in Rome. And so Pilate had to be and here's another tidbit that I failed to mention. Seditionist had been violently anti-Semitic, and he resented the fact that the Jews were treated throughout the empire with sort of kid gloves. They weren't forced to burn the incense and so on. And he had begun to institute really rather severe and draconian anti-Semitic policies throughout the empire. But when he was executed, Tiberius reversed all of those. And so now it's not at all hard to see why Pilate in Jerusalem is going to be pretty responsive to the Jewish demands, because Tiberius back in Rome is in a mood to to protect the Jews, to be honest with you. And so again, now here's my point, and it may not be a point worth giving this much time to, but here's the point, if I can make sense of it. If Jesus died in 30 AD, Seditionist is not a factor, because his sedition is only discovered in 31. So we can't appeal to him to help us explain that perceived disparity. Whereas if he died in 31, if Seditionist, all right, let's start out where we should. If Jesus died in 33, then we know that Seditionist had been executed in 31, and we have good explanation as to why maybe earlier in his reign, in his period as the prefect, Pilate had been a little more severe and a little more insensitive to Jewish sensibilities. Now, in the narrative of the Passion Week, Pilate is going to be much more sensitive to the Jews by reason of Seditionist. So Seditionist, I think, becomes an important factor in that. And if that makes any sense to you, and I'll say it one more time, if Jesus' death is in 30 AD, then Seditionist is not a factor. He is still in charge back there, and he is still wielding those anti-Semitic policies. However, if Jesus died in 33, then that's after Seditionist's death. That's after Tiberius had reversed those anti-Semitic policies and more or less begun to be more protective of the Jews. There's a lot behind that, by the way. But and therefore Pilate's, and I would say only slightly more acquiescent attitude toward the Jews has a really solid historical basis, and that is the death of Seditionist. All right, now one other point till I get to the record, the biblical record, which was maybe where I should have started. But there is one other point, and I think it's important to make this case. Folks, that perceived disparity between the biblical Pilate and the extra-biblical Pilate is the basis of one of the most ubiquitous and dangerous heresies with regard to the biblical record that I know anything about. And this is basically the heresy. Now, stay with me if you will. So we start with this. Wait a minute. We know from history that Pilate was a brutal, unthinking, insensitive thug. The Bible represents Pilate as really acquiescing to the demands of the Jewish leadership. And that's why Jesus died, because ultimately Pilate acquiesced to the Jewish leadership. Now, that's what the Bible teaches. And so here is the heresy. They would say, well, we know from history that Pilate was a brutal thug. So the biblical representation of Pilate, I make all of these motions outside of this screen, but so the biblical record, the biblical picture of Pilate must be a fiction. It was manufactured. For some reason, the early church rewrote the story to make Pilate into this acquiescent, patient, and almost believing prefect, when in point of fact we know he's a thug. So now the question is, why would that be? And here's the answer. And you'll find this again and again. You'll hear it. It'll be assumed. Easter is upon us, and there are various, the cable channels and so on will carry various things and so on. And you watch for this. There is either stated or just assumed this notion that, well, the biblical record has been what actually happened was very, very much distorted in the biblical record, and they must have had an agenda. Why would you say the biblical record is distorted? Because we know that Pilate was a thug, and he's not a thug in the record. So here's the point. They would argue, many argue today, well, the early church knew that it was the Romans who hounded Jesus to death. But you see, the Romans were still in charge when the church was growing. And so if you're going to tell your neighbor about Jesus of Nazareth and that he died for you, your neighbor is going to ask, well, how did he die? And if you tell the truth, well, the Romans killed him. But the Romans are still in charge. And if you keep accusing the Romans of killing your Savior, they'll come and get you next. So they made up a story and they twisted it all. So they said, so again, you're talking to your neighbor. Jesus died for you. How did he die? Well, that'll get me in trouble. Let me think. You know what? It was the Jews. The Jews hounded him to death. And that's exactly the heresy. That is the story. And let me just say this, and I say it delicately, that this is absolutely universal in the Jewish world. Because again, the record is not complementary to the leadership of the Jews in the death of Jesus. And so they will revert to this idea, and this will be it. I'm going to say it one more time. The Pilate in the Bible is this acquiescent, gentle man, a little overstated. The Pilate in extra-biblical history is a brutal thug. So clearly, because extra-biblical history is dependable and the Bible is not, clearly the story must have been deliberately distorted and twisted and reversed so that now the Jews are the ones who are hounding Jesus to death, and Pilate is just sort of an unwilling participant. Now, listen, folks, I said to you yesterday, I am so anxious to make the case that yes, is it true that the Jewish leadership did in fact commit themselves to killing Jesus? Yes. Had Jesus, the actions of Jesus brought them to a level of anger that it's hard to imagine, hard to appreciate? Yeah. And it was everything that Jesus did was appropriate and righteous, but clearly they were beside themselves with anger. And I think you add to it this dynamic of Jesus' claim to be God come in the flesh, which was so bottomlessly difficult, and the record of the scriptures, which is absolutely true, absolutely dependable, is clear that the Jewish leadership and sort of dragging the people along were responsible for the death of Jesus. And that's exactly what Peter says as we saw in both Acts 3 and it's what Paul says in Acts 13. The biblical record is absolutely clear. And it's just as clear that Pilate, I believe, as I talked about yesterday, that Pilate, as Peter says, was determined to let Jesus go. So just know that tie it all together, and then I want to take you to the biblical record, that the year of the crucifixion, I think, is 33. One of the arguments that I use, or one of the elements that is helpful to me, is that if Jesus died in 33, you have the Seditionist dynamic to help you understand whatever slight disparity there is. But I'm going to go back and insist that both Philo and Josephus had an axe to grind and were guilty of some measure of character assassination. And Pilate really was the picture that we get in the Gospels of Pilate is really quite accurate. He was a Roman prefect where there was rebellion. He did respond with force, but he lasted for 10 years. There are extra-biblical evidences, strong extra-biblical evidence that he really was very sensitive to the Jewish people, and what we have in the record is entirely accurate. All right, forgive me if that's horribly pedantic, but you can be checking your email this whole time probably. Anyway, so let me take you to the biblical record, because what I want to do now is let's talk about Saturday. And as I started to say, as I said earlier, actually, there's not much in the record, but I want to start with Mark. And I have gone to the four Gospels and just marked, that is highlighted, colored various elements of the story, because really there are three issues I want to talk about real quickly. Number one is the signs that were attendant upon the death of Jesus. And then secondly, the burial itself. And then thirdly, what the Bible says about Saturday. So there were some physical signs. As I said, God put his fingerprint, God in heaven, the Father, put his fingerprint all over this series of events to make the case that this was not just another historical incident. It was historical in all of its parts, but it was divinely orchestrated, and as is all history, but in a very special way and it was, as I say, he put his fingerprints all over it. So here you have, and I'm going to say again, in yellow, I have the signs, and then in orange, the burial, and then Saturday, events that are recorded as having happened on Saturday in the pink, and you're not going to see that for a bit. So here is Mark, and in Mark chapter 15, he simply says that as Jesus died, and actually Luke makes it, I'll come back to it, it seems to be even as he was dying, then the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So the most dramatic and the best remembered, perhaps, of the signs is the veil. Now that veil, there's a lot of discussion. How many veils were there? Two was the one. Well, clearly we're talking about the veil that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies was where, in the first temple, you had the Ark of the Covenant and the glory cloud. Now, every indication we have, biblical and extra-biblical, is that the Holy of Holies was empty in the second temple, in the temple built by Zerubbabel and remodeled by Herod, and where Jesus went to worship. But you did have the veil, and the veil, and it was very large. It was as thick as a man's hand from here to here. It was a number of animal skins, and so it wasn't gossamer. No, when you think of a veil, don't think what the bride has over her face. This is not a gossamer veil. This is a heavy linen and various materials and so on that were used. And we're told in the Talmud that it took 40 men to put it in place. And it's clearly supernatural when the veil is rent from the top to the bottom. And I listen, there's a lot of discussion about where this, there's question as to whether or not this was visible. I don't think it was visible. Now there is, all right, let me go somewhere else. There is some remarkable extra biblical remembrance of some very strange things that happened in the temple about 40 years before the destruction. That's what the Talmud says. It's actually in the Talmud, it's in the Tosefta, it's in some of the apocryphal literature and so on. The very, very early Jewish literature remembers this, that about 40 years before the temple was destroyed. Now I'm going with 33, so that's 37 years, but nonetheless, it fits. About 40 years before the temple was destroyed. And then it talks, the various Jewish sources talk about, there's some remembrance of the veil having to be repaired. But there's also doors swinging open. There are lights appearing. Now, this is extra biblical. It's late. It's not, I don't put too much confidence in it. It is rather fascinating and so on. And study sometime just the various supernatural occurrences that the Jewish literature remembers as having happened about 40 years before the temple was destroyed. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Now, as I say, one of the remembrances is that the veil had to be repaired. So I'll just leave it at that clearly we know that the veil was torn in two, top to bottom. It was a supernatural act. It would have taken a great deal of engineering effort even to slice that veil, but it tears spontaneously on its own in half. There is some debate or some question. I don't think there should be very much debate, especially among Christians, but there is some question as to exactly what this signifies, because some believe that it signifies the glory cloud departing. Now, the glory cloud wasn't there, but the glory cloud was in the first temple, and the departure of the glory cloud is recorded in some detail in Ezekiel 8-11, and it's very, very significant when the glory cloud left, when the theocratic rule of King Yahweh was suspended. And so some will say, well, maybe that's what's going on, that just as back then he deserted the temple, so in 33, with the death of Jesus, he deserted the temple in some more spiritual, metaphorical sense. I don't think that's what's at stake. I think it's not God departing, but us having access. And I get that primarily perhaps out of Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 20, where Paul exults over this new and living way which we have to access. And this picture, let us come boldly to the throne of God and so on. When you read that passage in Hebrews, don't be thinking of some Western throne room. It's the temple. And the Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant was the throne room of King Yahweh. And he invited you to come to approach him. That is in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, when King Yahweh was ruling from his throne between the cherubim and the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, his subjects were invited. Under certain circumstances, they were required to come and appear before him. So King Yahweh in the Old Testament invited you to come. But here's the thing. You only came so close. You only came through the agency of a priest, and you always came with a sacrifice. One of those 5 sacrifices, Leviticus 1-7. So the point is, God invited you to approach him, but you only came so close. Whereas now, because the veil has been rent, there is this new and living way, and we are invited not to stop in the courtyard of the temple, as was true in the Old Testament. This is Hannah, for instance, approaching King Yahweh and making a vow and asking for a son. That's exactly what's going on there. But now we can come boldly to the very throne of grace. We can walk into the Holy of Holies. Now, folks, this is new covenant truth. These are new covenant blessings. This is so bottomlessly blessed, but I've spent too much time elsewhere. So let me just say again, there are some remarkable signs. The most remarkable, and the one that's going to be mentioned again and again, is the veil is rent in 2. And again, it's a supernatural act. It's remembered, at least under the heading of there were repairs that had to be made about 40 years before the temple was destroyed. But it bespeaks this blessed reality that through the shed blood of Christ, a new and living way has been opened to us. All right. There are other signs. Let me keep reading there in Mark. I'm in Mark 15. When the centurion, well, no, there are more signs, but I want to come back to it. The centurion who stood it, saw it, he cried out, this man was the Son of God. And then Mark goes on to say that there were also women looking on from afar, that is, to the crucifixion, and we're looking on the rending of the veil. They were looking on the crucifixion, and it lists who those were. All right, now let me take you to Luke. I've made a mess of things, but here is the rending of the veil, the darkness, and we talked about this before. In the yellow is I'm in Luke now, and Luke chapter 23, and he says about the 6th hour there was darkness over the earth until the 9th hour. We saw this yesterday. The sun was darkened, the veil of the temple was torn in 2. And it seems to be just as Jesus is crying out, it is finished. And then, although we got to put the Gospels together to find that, but anyway, because it was just before he said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. He breathed his last. And then he tells the story of the centurion and others watching. So the only real signs that are mentioned in either Mark or Luke are the darkness and the rending of the veil. I'll take you to John, although there's really not much to see because, where am I here? Yeah, that's the burial. He mentions nothing of the signs. John mentions nothing. Now I want to take you back to Matthew, because Matthew gives us a great deal more, a significant amount. So here is, again, in the yellow are the signs. And he says, this is Matthew, the veil of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood it, he says, truly, this man was the Son of God. But you know what? I have to take you down because there are other signs. I didn't highlight them. Oh, such a mess I'm making here this morning. In verse, where am I? I'm in Mark. All right. Hold on here. All right, here is Matthew. I had this all arranged. Here is Matthew. All right, so here in the yellow is his record of the signs. The veil of the temple was torn in 2. Watch this. The earth quaked and the rocks were split. So there was some sort of an earthquake. It was probably quite local, and it had the effect of causing fissures in the rocks. But here is perhaps the most remarkable. In verse 52, the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And then, coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Now, factor this in, because this really relates to, well, All right. It says specifically that it was only after his resurrection that they went into the holy city. But again, can you imagine the impact that this would have had? God is putting his fingerprints on this. And in so many ways, he is making it absolutely undeniable and irresistible, as you can't miss it, that this God is in this. And that this death that the Nazarene, the pretender Messiah, is dying is infinitely important. And so God just, like I say, puts his fingerprints all over it. Now, what's at stake here, evidently, and this is, there are many today in the evangelical world who are questioning this, and this has become kind of a crux passage as far as your commitment to inerrancy. And many are saying, well, this is probably just a legend, and these stories got started and Matthew put it in, and we can sort out myth from fact here. No, there's no myth here. There's no legend here. It may become a legend, but this happened. And evidently what happened is this, that, and I like to say, I believe that these are not resurrections, that these saints who came out of the graves did not put on immortality. Because what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, when he's talking about the resurrections, is that Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. And after that, those that are his at his coming. This is the end of 1 Corinthians 15. So he gives us the program of resurrections. And again, we're going to distinguish here between resurrections where we put on immortality, we're given our glorified resurrected bodies, and resuscitation, where people who have died are brought back to mortal life. And all of the raisings in the Old Testament and the New, Lazarus, the widow's son, and so on, all of these were resuscitations. They were brought back to mortal life. So they're going to have to die once again. Some people say, well, wouldn't the Bible say you only die once? Hebrews 10, or Hebrews is appointed on the man. No, what Hebrews says is that God's plan is that you die once. There are some exceptions, but we all die once. So what that verse is saying is that unless you're taken in the rapture, God's appointment for all of us by reason of the fall and so on is that we're going to die, and after that the judgment. But there are a select number, and these are among them, who, having died physically, mortally, are brought back to mortal life. And I will say, secondly, that I think these are almost certainly people who died rather recently, simply because I believe that this is part of God's strategy to put his fingerprints on this entire episode. So and the point is this, that if somebody who had died 500 years ago came back to life and walked into the city and said, I'm back, I've been gone for 500 years, you'd have them institutionalized, okay? But if grandma, you know what I'm saying? Or if your little 12-year-old boy who died and you buried him not very long ago, and they come back from the tomb, and now you're getting your attention. So I'm just saying that there are these little tiny insights, and they're told us sometimes almost in passing. But when you very carefully and deliberately insinuate that into your understanding of the record, we're trying to reconstruct this as wholly as we possibly might. So we calibrate our heads to include this dynamic that on Sunday morning, not only was a tomb found empty, but there were, we don't know how many, but there were some folks who showed up in the city. It says they went into the city and appeared to many. And this is God making Jesus resurrect. I don't know any better way to say it, putting his fingerprints on this entire thing. All right, so much. That's what we have for the signs now, and they're really rather dramatic. Let me go back and just rehearse real quickly because we've been here. Oh man, there's something else I want to talk about. I was going to be brief today. I'm so sorry, but we want to talk about the burial. That happened on Friday, and we mentioned it in passing, but there is a good deal of record of it. And Matthew says, and I think this is important, many women who followed Jesus ministering to from Galilee, ministering to him, were there. They had come from Galilee. And it lists some of them. And then it says, when this is after the death. This is after the death of Jesus. And we're just told that there were these women who loved Jesus and who had followed him and helped him and so on. Luke tells us. But then when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. He had become a disciple of Jesus. And he went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate commanded the body to be given to him. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in clean linen cloth, laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. There you are. He rolled a large stone against the door of the tomb and departed. And Mary and the other Mary were sitting opposite the tomb. They're laying, they want to prepare for the next morning, because it's late on Friday when this happens. And so as the sun goes down, you ought to make ready for Sabbath and so on, but not the next morning, but on Sunday morning, they're going to come back to this tomb to anoint the body, of course, to finish the burial preparation, but they're going to find the tomb empty. Here is Mark's telling of the same thing. That was Matthew, where we just were, and it's pretty much exactly the same details and so on. So I'll just leave it. Luke, really, his is a bit different. This is Luke. And he says there was a man named Joseph, a council member. So Luke, the historian, having carefully researched and interviewed, he gives us the insight that Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin. Council here is the Sanhedrin, a good and just man who had not consented to their decision indeed. That's important. Again, we're trying to insinuate all the detail we can. And it's helpful to remember that not all of the Sanhedrin rose up against Jesus, but it says he was from a Jewish city, and he also was waiting for the kingdom of God. In other words, before he encountered Jesus, I think this is the point that Luke is making. He was already a follower of Yahweh. He was already, if you don't mind, twice born. He was a believer, but he was he was evidently wealthy, and he sat on the council and so on. But he went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. I want you to remember that. They took it down, wrapped it in linen, laid it in the tomb that was hewn out of the rock where no one had ever lain before. And that day was the preparation. That's another word for Friday, because the Sabbath drew near. Now, this is when he is taking him off the cross. And it says that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew near. Again, that's why I say just a simple reading would suggest this is Friday. But the woman who had come followed after, and they observed the tomb and how his body was laid. Now, again, they are making plans to return after the Sabbath on Sunday morning. John gives us another insight. He says, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. So he gives us this insight. He was secretly a disciple. So again, it gets fleshed out a little bit more all the time. But he asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took the body of Jesus. And then John also tells us, and I've capitalized it here just to remind me, and Nicodemus. So we're also told that Nicodemus was party to burying the body of Jesus, who at first came to Jesus by night, brought these 100 pounds of spices and so on, took the body of Jesus, bound it in strips of linen with the spices. This was as the custom of the Jews is to bury, so that's how they do it. In the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, a farm, and in the garden, a new tomb where nobody had laid. And we find out elsewhere it's Joseph's tomb, Joseph of Arimathea. There they laid Jesus because of the Jews' preparation day. That is, preparation means we're scurrying about getting ready for Shabbat. It's Friday, for the tomb was nearby. So this evidently was a last-minute expediency. They wanted to give the body a burial. They normally, this is important, normally one of the restrictions was, I mentioned this before, that if a man died as a seditionist, if a man died, this is important, having been convicted of sedition, his body was not to be buried, or at least it was to be exposed for a time, and then maybe the bones could be taken away. But that's why they had gone to Pilate and asked, and Pilate had given them permission to bury Jesus. All right. And then, so those are the four Gospels as to their record of the burial. Now, let me say one thing about that, and that is this, and this is an important note, folks. Listen, it's in this season of the year, quite consistently, as I hear this or that preacher or read this or that article or whatever, I hear people make what I think is a careless but really dangerous misstatement. And it'll be something like this, that Jesus died having been convicted of sedition. And in point of fact, that's wrong. Jesus died having, in the most spectacular way, having been exonerated of sedition, having been exculpated, having been pronounced innocent. You see, there was only one man on the face of the earth who was authorized to declare Jesus innocent or guilty. That man was Pilate. That's what Pilate said to Jesus there in that second interview. Don't you know I've got authority? I have to make a decision here. Now, after careful examination, personal, private examination, we looked at this in John 18. And I think after hearing an absolutely airtight argument by Jesus that it makes absolutely no sense, it would be insane to suggest that this man was a seditionist. I mean, take away all of the other issues and so on that are so much a part of this, but let's just ask ourselves, was Jesus a seditionist, or was he found guilty of sedition? Well, no. The one man on the face of the earth who had the authority and who had conducted the trial 5 times in the face of every overwhelming impulse or pressure and influence is the word I want, in the face of every conceivable influence to the otherwise, 5 times in the record. And there are several insinuations beside this, but 5 explicit statements where Pilate says the man is innocent. He's not going to die as a seditionist. And and ultimately, even the accusing Jewish leadership, at least passively or by inference, acknowledged that he wasn't a seditionist. Because in John 19:7, after Pilate had for the 5th time said he's not going to die, I'm not going to crucify him. Remember, they said, well, then by our law, he ought to die. I hear them saying, all right, this was all trumped up. The case really can't be made. But I'm telling you, by our law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God, John 19, verse 7. So I go back to it. It's so very, very important because Jesus he's going to die as an unblemished lamb. And to whatever degree, even if it was a false charge, nonetheless, if the official Roman record is that Jesus died having been convicted of sedition, he died as a criminal. You remember that the thief next to him, that is the thief who finally came to faith, looked across Jesus and said to the other thief, we're getting what we deserve. Well, if Jesus was convicted of sedition, he's getting what he deserves. Folks, it is so bottomlessly important. And I think the way the record is laid out, the way the drama unfolds and so on, is at least in part so much very much intended to make this point that Jesus was not convicted of sedition. And yea, verily, the official record, the official Roman pronouncement, again, by the only man authorized to make that announcement, and by the only man who had done the kind of interrogation to qualify him to make that announcement, Pilate 5 times said, this man is without fault. I find no fault in him. Now, let me take it a step further. There are several other indications that Jesus was not convicted of sedition. And one of them is that his body was buried. Another one is the titulus. Remember Pilate, when he wrote, this is the King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, the Jewish authorities came and said, no, write that, write He claimed to be the king of the Jews. He was a seditionist, right? He said he was the king of the. Pilate refused to do it. Do you hear once again? He's saying, I'm not going to say the man is a seditionist. Have you not heard me? I've told you at least 5 times. The man is not a seditionist. So Pilate's testimony, the at least inferential testimony or deducible testimony of the titulus, and then the fact that Pilate turned Jesus' body over to be buried, all of that is narrative, overwhelming, univocal testimony. Jesus was not a seditionist. He didn't die having been convicted of sedition. He died having been, in the most spectacular ways, exonerated of that charge. But don't stop there, because I think it's also just as important to make this point, that Jesus did die the death that Rome designed for seditionists. Now, I'm going to pick up on that tomorrow, so I'm going to leave it there. But just contemplate for a quick moment. And I think there is, all right, let me just adumbrate it this way. 3 times in the Gospels, and we're going to talk about this explicitly and trace them tomorrow, 3 times in John, actually, and it's always the lips of Jesus saying this, in John 3, in John 8, and in John 12, Jesus speaks of being lifted up. And John tells us in John 12, verse 32, that what Jesus was talking about specifically was being lifted up in crucifixion. He was talking about the kind of death he would die. And Jesus says, it's imperative that I die by crucifixion. Now, all right, let me real quickly. In John 3 and verse 14, Jesus says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. In John chapter 8, arguing with the Pharisees who are saying, you're just speaking for yourself, you're not speaking for the Father, Jesus says, when I am lifted up, you'll know I speak for the Father. And then in John chapter 12, he says, if I be lifted up, will draw him into myself. And then John, in the next verse, verse 32, I think it is, he says, this is a remarkable statement. I'm going to take you to it tomorrow. This spake he concerning the type of death he would die. Now, let me come way back. Jesus died having been exonerated of sedition. And yet it was important for him to die by being lifted up in crucifixion, and that's the death that Rome designed for a seditionist. And we can go to the narrative and trace how that happened, because he was brought to Pilate by the Sanhedrinists, accused of sedition. And so everything was in readiness for him to die the death of a seditionist. But Pilate became a huge monkey wrench in those works, and so he refused to do it. But after an hour and a half of cajoling, and after Jesus, I believe, had privately given permission to Pilate to go ahead, Pilate did turn him over to be crucified. So it's just a stunning confluence of realities, that according to Jesus, it was imperative that he die by being lifted up. And yet it could not be that he would die having been convicted of a capital crime. And so the story unfolds in such a way that he is accused of sedition. He is again and again, in the most forceful, dramatic way, exonerated of sedition. But then he does, in fact, die the death of a seditionist. So my point is simply this, that be careful in the way we conceive of this. It seems to me that it works out in God's careful superintending providence. It works out in such detail, in such a way that all of that's true. He is exonerated of sedition, but he does die the death a seditionist deserves to die. And I think we ought to honor all of that. Well, I'm going to leave it there. There is, I'm in the middle of something. Let me think here for a minute. All right. So the fact that he died. All right. I almost forgot what I came to do. It's the story of my life. Let me take you back to Matthew, and with this, we're done finally. I was going to be brief. In Matthew, which is here, you have some verses in pink. And what happened? All right, I'll just go there. Because Matthew is the only one who gives us any record of what happened on Saturday itself. So let me pick it up there. This is what we're supposed to be talking about today, and say, this is his record. I put it in pink, and I was trying to, I don't know that I spread it out so much. It wasn't very effective anyway. But he's the only one who tells us anything about Saturday itself. The others all leap from the burial to Sunday morning, to the first morning of the week, but the first day of the week. But this is what Matthew says on the next day. So here is the burial. They came and he put him in a tomb. And then Matthew alone tells us something about the day we are remembering today. He says, on the next day, which followed the day of preparation. Now, what Matthew is saying is, it's the Sabbath. And so it's a quiet day, but because he was buried on Friday, he's only going to rise on Sunday. But, and so the point is that we would not expect that there would be any activity among the Jewish players in this drama. It's Shabbat. They're going to be resting and quiet. We'll come back to that. But on the other hand, it says, and I think he's making a point here, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together to Pilate. So they're kind of being a little careless, perhaps, about, although this is within the Sabbath zone and so on. But at any rate, they come to Pilate and they say, Pilate is undoubtedly there in Herod's palace on the western side of the city where he stays when he is in town. Remember, he lives in Caesarea Maritima, but he's come up for the feast. And they say, now this is stunning, sir, we remember while he was still alive how that how that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise. Now, folks, this is stunning because they remembered it when almost none of Jesus' followers remembered it. And I say that because they didn't anticipate it. Now, I've said this to you before, that again and again, you have it first of all in Matthew 16:21, I'm going to be taken by I'm going to go to Jerusalem, taken by the chief priests and scribes and be suffer many things and be killed. And on the third day, I'll rise again. Same thing in Luke 18, verse 31, on the third day, I'll rise again. And yet, as I said, one might have thought that once the death actually occurred, some of Jesus' followers would have gotten their heads together and said, oh, it's horrible. Wait, don't you, wait, there is this. He did say he was going to, I don't know, that's pretty, well, he did say it. I know what let's do. Let's go hide behind a tree and see what happens. But none of them did. And again, when the women came on Sunday morning bearing the message of the empty tomb, their reply was, you're mad, you're crazy. And perhaps the microcosm of those two on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24 is as instructive as anywhere, because you remember, again, I mentioned yesterday, they're using the past tense. We thought. And they said, this is really kind of stunning in this regard. They knew, saying is this, that the backdrop to this, and I should have said it in the first place, we have in the record him saying this to the disciples, but he said it again and again, and the word was out. Because even his enemies, the Jewish leaders, said, that deceiver said he was going to rise on the third day. When the women came to the tomb and found it empty, the angel said to them, he has arisen as he told you. So at least the promise of the resurrection. So my point is that one might have thought that they would have anticipated it, but they didn't. And it's interesting, I was going to say too, that those men on the road to Emmaus, they said, because Jesus said, what are you so unhappy about? And they said, haven't you heard? And then they told him, this man, the Nazarene, and then we barely thought, and then they said this, it's now the third day since these things happened. Seems like that phrase, the third day, maybe one of them might have said, it's now the third day. You know what? Didn't he talk about the third day? But no, none of that happens. So my point is, and I've had a couple people respond by saying, how can this be? That Jesus was so explicit, that the Old Testament scripture so clearly anticipates the death of the Messiah. And yet when Jesus began to speak about Messiah, it was at best confusing and foreign, and at worst scandalizing and offensive to those to whom he spoke. And it was so foreign to them that it didn't register. And so now, on the third day, I'm talking about the Luke 24 passage, it never even occurs to them. It's really stunning. And frankly, I don't have an answer. I will say this, that I think it's somewhere between they could not, or some admixture of they could not and they would not receive it. And I think what Peter tells us about the confusion even of the Old Testament saint, the Old Testament prophet, as to how Messiah could both suffer and die on the one hand and be glorified on the other. How can he suffer and reign? That was a problem because they didn't understand two comings. And I think there was probably a profound sense, a very definitional sense, in which they kind of picked the one they liked the best and put all their attention there. But I'm going to come back to the narrative before us. Is it not a bit stunning that even the leaders picked up on this? They heard it. And so whether they heard it from his lips or whether that was the word going about and so on, but the narrative is this, that they come to Pilate and they say, he said, after 3 days I'll arise, and therefore command that the tomb, this is back to verse 64, they say to Pilate, command that the tomb be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away. Quite frankly, they were giving his disciples a lot more credit than they deserved because they just hadn't heard it. And say to the people, he has risen from the dead, so the last deception will be worse than the first. And Pilate said to them, you have a guard. He said, okay, fine, you have a guard, go your way, make it as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. Now the sealing of the stone here, again, it was not a huge stone. Most of the graves, the grave that Joseph had dug for his family here would have had a small opening, simply because you wanted a stone that was, you could physically roll back and forth. And I mentioned before that on the, well, I'll just leave that alone. I guess it doesn't fit here. But the point is that this sealing is sealing in the sense of making it secure. What they undoubtedly did was take some wax and lay it across the seam between the stone and the cave itself, and then press a signet ring, or maybe more than one, into that wax. And therefore, you could not roll that tomb away without breaking that seal. And if the seal was broken, you could go to the person who had thus sealed it, and he would testify that he hadn't opened it, and therefore somebody must have stolen, somebody must have broken into it. They're just rendering it secure is what's going on. Now, we'll talk about this more tomorrow as we contemplate the resurrection. But again, I just want to reinforce the one thing that is recorded as happening on Saturday is that the Jewish enemies of Jesus come to Pilate and talk him into securing the tomb, lest his disciples come and steal the body. Now we'll return to that tomorrow in our discussion, and there'll be a lot of thought about the events of Resurrection Sunday throughout the day tomorrow, and God honoring every one of them. So let me just close this way. First of all, forgive me for the prolix character here. I got into something I was going to do in maybe 10 or 20 minutes. It took me 45 minutes, and shame on me. But on the other hand, let's just set the scene. So it's Saturday. It's Saturday now. Let's think about Saturday then. It's a day of rest. It's quiet. But this particular day is enveloped. It is festooned. It is with a cacophony of emotions. I just mixed so many word pictures there. It's absolutely incoherent. But can you imagine the cacophony of emotions gripping the hearts of various people on this day? Yesterday, the man whom we had embraced as Messiah, the man who had, for all of those months, healed so many hundreds and hundreds of people, the man who had carried himself with such absolute Old Testament perfection, that is all that the Old Testament demanded of Messiah. He lived it out in every conceivable way, but he was crucified. And some of us watched as he breathed his last, and his body is laying in a tomb. How has this impacted the leadership? Well, I think they're delighted. They have a tremendous feeling of accomplishment. Last Tuesday night, they had gathered in despair, and they said, we can't do it during the feast. But that apostle Judas had come and he'd helped us, and we got it done. And we were absolutely afraid that if we tried it, the city would riot. It didn't riot. He's dead. We got it done. But I think there was also a spirit of trepidation. And I think it's best reflected in the passage we just read. The fact that the senior most of those leaders had gone to Pilate, and they said, we got to take steps here. And given their steps, I think it bespeaks a quiet soul trepidation. Oh my goodness, I hope it's over. So the leaders, I think they're excited, delighted, sense of accomplishment. But what about Jesus' followers? Well, there's certainly grief. There is disappointment. We verily thought within ourselves this was the Messiah. There's despair. Can you imagine? If he's not, who could be? I mean, we expected before the week was out that there would be a kingdom. We apostles were anticipating decorating our own little throne rooms, if you don't mind. Okay, maybe not. But the point is, we were going to sit on 12 thrones. If that's not the one, if the Nazarene is not the one, do we have any hope at all? Are our scriptures even dependable, for heaven's sakes? If that's not the one, but he's dead. And there must have been confusion. And I think on the part of some, there was probably some little sense of anger. I gave 3 years of my life to this. And now it's all a fiction. It's all gone. Jesus just hung there on that cross. And now his body is in a tomb. I think all of that was part of this Saturday. But tomorrow's coming. Sunday is coming. We'll gather tomorrow at 4 o'clock and spend some time on the historical record and just try and celebrate together that which is so worthy of celebration, and that is the resurrection of our Lord. Thank you for being with me again. I'm embarrassed about the excursus at the beginning, but I hope some of this was helpful. Lord bless.